Game industry has always been on a constant move, so no matter how much we loved 16-bit consoles, the transition towards 32 bits and 3D graphics era had to happen sooner or later. It was such a sweep that today's console doesn't need introducing. Its name still appears in headlines, and chances are that you had, if not the very console we'll be talking about in this video, then you surely had one of its successors. Welcome to Drigmatic. Please get comfortable. Today we will be reminiscing about Sony Playstation 1. But before we go on, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button. This will help us a lot in the development of the channel. Thank you. It all started right where we stopped in the last video. The market was being torn apart by the console wars, and Nintendo was striving to make a CD drive for SNES. As always, I strongly advise to watch our previous video to get a better understanding of the picture. Add-on development contract was attributed to Sony, which wasn't interested in video games at the time, yet had already managed to collab with Nintendo while developing an audio chip for SNES. Work went on for several years and resulted in a prototype of a hybrid console called Playstation. It's the gap between two words that makes the name different from today's variant. Everything was going well, but not long before the CES trade show, where the presentation was supposed to take place, Nintendo reread the contract terms and just changed their minds. They didn't like that Sony was going to get rights for the discs of the new format and consequently a share in profits from video game sales. Thus, on first day of the show, Sony announced the new console as well as collaboration with the Big N, and the next day Nintendo terminated the contract and announced further cooperation with Philips. The event was unpleasant to say the least. But the lads didn't give up and went to Sega representatives with a proposal. Why not unite against a mutual enemy? However, they were told that Sony doesn't know squat about making game consoles and that Sega doesn't need any assistance. Sony's executives were furious about the situation. But they weren't simply throwing a tantrum. They put the energy to good use and started working on the stagnating project by themselves. As a result, PlayStation 1 was released in Japan in December 1994 and 6 months later in the US. Sony made sure that its beloved offspring got strong support from game developers, so the starting lineup of titles was a pleasant surprise. From the get-go, one could play a few sports games and racing sims, a shooter, 3 fighting games, a platformer, and even an air battle simulator. We'll talk about the last one in a bit. Remember the dynamic yet simplistic Afterburner? Or the technological and hasteless Star Fox? At the launch of PlayStation, Namco introduced Air Combat, a flight simulator that took all the best of its predecessors. The game proposed us to choose one of the 16 planes and use it to do some missions. The controls of the aircraft were not quite realistic, but that wasn't really an issue. Much more important was the ability to fly in 3D space, being able to freely maneuver wherever you want. You could fly in third person or first person. The second option made it easier to strike your enemies with machine gun fire and missiles. Truth be told, the game's sequel made this game formula even better. It also changed the name of the future series to Ace Combat. After the first game, there is not much that can be said about the second one. They added more planes, the graphics got better, now there was a story connecting missions, and of course, the action became even more dynamic. However, I personally remember this game not even for all of this, but for its soundtrack. After really beautiful 8 and 16-bit compositions, PlayStation indulged us with masterpieces like this. All in all, it is a perfect example of what the new generation of video games was like at the beginning and how it evolved over time. But Namco is remembered not because of the marvelous Ace Combat, but for the Tekken fightings. As much as we spent brawling as two flashy ninjas in Mortal Kombat, so much was spent in the first, second, and especially the third games of this wonderful series. Tekken offered us a whole selection of fighters, each with his own biography and relatively realistic fighting style. True, there wasn't as much magic and weapons as in MK, and the characters were fighting with bare hands, but that didn't make the fights any less spectacular. However, there was an exception to this rule, Ninja Yoshimitsu, who was able to perform a sword slash if he knew which buttons to press. Just like Ace Combat, Tekken possessed a great soundtrack and full 3D, even to the point where in the third game you could simply walk aside from your opponent to dodge. What more could we ask a great fighting game for? Exactly, the ability to play a combat version of volleyball. Yes, Tekken 3 could do that as well. And I can say from my own experience that the battles in this mode were almost fiercer than in the standard game. By the way, I like to play as King, a wrestler in a jaguar mask. In addition to the usual moves, he boasted a whole series of grapples that, if performed well, could take away almost all of his opponent's health bar. I couldn't perform all these grapples, but I was pretty good at some of them, and I was pretty happy with that. And who was your favorite character? Share your main fighter in the comments and let the discussion begin. And I'll move on to the topic of console mascots, which comes up quite often in my videos. Looking at characters like Mario and Sonic, it's easy to understand how the company wants to present its game system. The first PlayStation didn't have an official mascot, but the unofficial one was extremely memorable. His name is Crash Bandicoot. For starters, let me tell you that Bandicoot is an Australian marsupial and, most importantly, existing animal. I've been told about it by my well-read friends, with whom I've had long arguments trying to prove it's a fox. It's about time I apologized to them. I was indeed wrong. Unlike most of his fellow platformers' protagonists, Crash is a kind character, but not laden with noble motives. He was once an ordinary Bandicoot, but one day, evil Dr. Neo Cortex captured him to make the general of his army of modified animals. Things went a little sideways, and instead of high intelligence, Crash was granted with mild insanity, which is quite noticeable on his low polygon cute little face. In the first game of the series, Bandicoot is on a race against time to save his girlfriend, who is held captive by the Doctor. And afterwards, he simply goes on to simply prevent him from carrying out his villainous plans. And I have to say, it's quite interesting after Princess saving Mario, heroic in his own way, and environment protecting Sonic, to play as a character who seeks adventures just for the sake of it, because he's unable to fathom more complicated matters. The whole buck wildery was complemented by Crash's great moving capabilities, particularly high jumps and iconic spinning. Of course, earlier these spins reminded us of the Tasmanian Devil from Looney Tunes, but here this move was needed to punch numerous enemies and smash even more numerous crates. All of it happened to look so cartoonish and funny that it was impossible to stop. The variety of locations was also a pleasant surprise. Bandicoot could find himself in the jungle, on a river, amidst the ruins of some temple, or in the dark corridors of some castle. In the second game, lively winter and sci-fi locations were added, and to remember where Crash found himself in the third game because of time travel, my oh my. To put it brief, everything we knew about exploration games with cartoonish characters underwent a complete rebirth in 3 dimensions. But I must say, the 2D games were doing great on the new console as well. It's time for our apparently permanent column. How's Castlevania doing? New game, titled Symphony of the Night, was released on PlayStation 1. Remember how in the video about SNES I explained what Metroidvania is? If you don't, I suggest you rewatch it. In a nutshell, it's a game with one huge location that you have to explore to find new items and acquire new abilities, which will help you get to the parts of the map that were previously inaccessible. Back then, Symphony of the Night became the epitome of the genre. All of a sudden, this time we were not given control of Belmont, instead we were playing as Count Dracula's son, the mighty Alucard. Actually, we were already given control of Alucard in the third Castlevania. Since then, he has learned a whole bunch of new tricks, sword fencing, various jumps and dashes, not to mention his astonishing repertoire of magical abilities, which is impossible to cover without a separate video. I'll confine myself to mentioning that he can still turn into a bat. The necessity to explore Dracula's castle once again didn't surprise people familiar with the franchise, but the execution of the location was just as mind-blowing as it is now. The castle was filled with numerous secrets, to solve which you had to consult all of your friends, because it was not always obvious where and which of Alucard's many abilities would allow you to move forward. Fights with the undead were still there as well. Ordinary opponents could either be just a minor inconvenience or pose a serious challenge, while the bosses were no joke for sure. Once again, I'd like to give credit to the wonderful soundtrack of Castlevania, which in this game was jeopardized by just one thing: the funny voiceover, as if the sound was recorded in a bathroom.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh.
Still, such goofy moments didn't make the game less great. And if you wanted to see some great staging on the first PlayStation, you turned to various 3D shooters. And here it is a sin not to give credit to Hideo Kojima, who gave us the legendary stealth action Metal Gear Solid. Here's the synopsis. We play as a retired soldier and spy named Solid Snake, who was summoned for a covert operation. Terrorists have put their hands on dangerous nuclear weapons, and Snake, under our control, needs to sneak into their base and stop the villains. Even in a couple of words, this sounds pretty epic. While in the game itself, with all the details and plot twists, this story completely plunged us into the atmosphere of a real spy action movie. Kojima's main idea was to use cinematic techniques in the game, and it's hard to say he didn't achieve his goal. They didn't put eyes on the characters' faces because of the limitations imposed by graphics, but I trusted every word of the low polygon models regardless. The gameplay deserves some appreciation as well. The obvious hide and seek and shootouts were complemented by uncountable details, forcing you to constantly think and analyze your actions. For example, an enemy could spot Snake's footprints left in the snow. In 1998, this was borderline fantasy. The boss named Psycho Mantis deserves a mention of his own. A telepath who can move objects and read minds. Proof the first, he asked the player to put the joystick on the floor, and the vibration indeed made it move. To prove the second, the boss would tell what other games have you played using the saves on your PlayStation's memory card. After tricks like these, talks about a huge two-legged machine capable of launching nuclear missiles didn't seem like something supernatural. For all sorts of weirdness, we would launch another, equally fascinating game, Silent Hill. It is widely seen as a classic horror game, but for me, Silent Hill has always been a pure thriller. The game kicked off slow and calmly. A writer named Harry Mason has just arrived in a foggy American town, searching for his missing daughter. Gradually, we were immersed in the town's history, where a religious cult had a crucial role. The cultists tried to bring their divinity back to life, what slowly but steadily infested the town with paranormal stuff. We were playing as an ordinary man, so he wasn't an excellent marksman, couldn't take too many hits, and didn't have any extraordinary abilities. That's why a silhouette of a monster appearing in the dark or in the fog truly made you fear for your virtual life. The game was abounding with all kinds of symbolisms and metaphors, so you could discuss the interpretation of an enemy for hours on end. However, usually the discussion was focused not so much on monsters as on the game's numerous puzzles and enigmas. Today, you can just watch a walkthrough or read a guide, but back in my time, I had a notebook of 96 sheets, scribbled with these unsolvable puzzles of Silent Hill. Moreover, the game had several endings, and the only way to figure out how to get them was by trial and error. To sum up, the game terrified and confused us, and that's what made it great. A similar approach was adopted by another horror game, Resident Evil. The 8th game of the series was released not so long ago, while on PlayStation 1 there were parts from 1 to 3. Unlike Silent Hill, this game was not a psychological thriller, but rather a B-movie horror game about zombies. But that doesn't mean Resident Evil is worse. It simply chose a different approach from the very beginning. The story told us about a secret lab called Umbrella, experiments of which resulted in the outbreak of a virus that turned people, and not only people really, into bloodthirsty zombies. Now, we took control over more combative characters who knew their way around firearms, but their skills didn't make things much easier. Resident Evil was the first survival horror game that created the genre, where survival meant that you never had enough ammo for all the enemies. You had to think about who to avoid, who to shoot, and who to sacrifice a part of your health bar to. Like both previous games that I've mentioned, Resident Evil was like a peculiar game film, both entertaining and terrifying. Next game in the series also followed this concept, though they executed it differently. But I wandered off to the field of games that make your skin crawl. I suggest we end today's video with something a bit more fun. One of the most popular hobbies at the time when the first PlayStation came out was skateboarding.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
And the Tony Hawk Pro Skater series of games contributed a lot to its popularization. Like all the games we've mentioned, it has also begun its journey from PlayStation 1. At first glance, one might say that the game is just a skater simulator, but that would not be quite right. Pro Skater is a true cultural imprint of the time. Uplifting rock music, skating areas representing famous real places, a whole bunch of renowned skaters and equally renowned skateboard tricks. A virtual time capsule, if you will. However, the game was more than just endless stunts. We were given a location where we had to achieve several goals at once, such as collecting dollars or knocking down different items. The game was also full of unlockable content of all sorts, from just secret places and locations to various cheats, characters, and clips. Looking at the sheer list of content, it was impossible not to want to uncover everything the game would allow you to. As a result, Tony Hawk Pro Skater required the same thorough exploration of locations as, say, Castlevania, only here you also had to skate, do stunts, and not fall off your skateboard. Needless to say, how many kids tried to master the skateboard in real life after beating the game. Not gonna lie, I was not one of them, but I had friends whom Tony Hawk literally dragged into this hobby. Just a fun fact to sum it all up. This game was made by the same guys who made the classic Spider-Man for the same platform. That's why in the second Pro Skater you can play as Peter Parker and do unusual stunts like pulling your skateboard with web. Looking at today's games alone, you realize that Sony Playstation 1 had practically rediscovered the world of video games. So many various adventures have we managed to remember in this video, and I'm sure that still everyone has the game that how could I not have mentioned? And that's perfectly fine, because PlayStation's games can be discussed for hours, which is why I humbly invite you to the comment section. Share which PlayStation 1 games you remember the most, and don't forget to like and ring the bell on your way to the section. See you in a week. Next time, we'll be talking about what our old friends Sega and Nintendo had to offer to the new player. Stay tuned.